Hello and welcome to And the Runner-Up Is. This week on the show, we're talking the 1940 Best Actress race at the Academy Awards, where Ginger Rogers won for her performance in Kitty Foyle. But why did she beat fellow nominees Bette Davis, Joan Fontaine, Katharine Hepburn, and Martha Scott? We'll explore all this and more today on the season premiere of And the Runner-Up Is. Hello, and welcome back to And the Runner-Up Is. I'm your host, Kevin Jacobson, here to talk about the 13th year of Best Actress at the Oscars, which covered the films of 1940. We'll be discussing why Ginger Rogers won, why the losers lost, and who we think was the runner-up of this Best Actress race. And this is the season premiere. I'm so excited to be back talking actresses. And my guest today is probably one of the best and smartest people out there who loves classic Hollywood. She is one of the fabulous hosts of Turner Classic Movies, where actually you can pretty much find all of these films we're going to talk about today on rotation. She is the author of 2 books about women in Hollywood, and she has another one on the way. Very exciting. You heard her on an episode of the Best Picture series in 2019 talking about 1956. Please welcome back to the show, Alicia Malone.
Hello. Hi, Kevin. Thank you so much for having me back on the show.
It's my honor, truly. And I'm so excited to have you on for this premiere here to talk about another all-star lineup we've got here.
Absolutely. I mean, this category we're going to be talking about, Best Actress, is filled with stars, and rewatching all the films has been a joy for me.
Oh, that's good. I love that. All right. Well, before we talk 1940, let's talk about Best Actress as a category and sort of let the people know about your faves over the years. So my first question for you, Alicia, is what is your favorite Best Actress win of all time?
That's a tough one. I have so many, and I'll probably change my mind about 5 times. If you ask me next week, I might have something different to say.
Yeah.
But as of right
Same.
now, one of my favorites is Judy Holliday winning for Born Yesterday. That was the year of 1950, so that was another all-star lineup in terms of Best Actress. You had Anne Baxter and Bette Davis from All About Eve. You had Gloria Swanson from Sunset Boulevard and Eleanor Parker from Caged. And everyone thought Gloria Swanson would win because this was her big comeback role after she was in the silent era, and she was essentially playing a version of herself. And she was in New York, and Judy Holliday was in New York. So they went to an event, and Judy Holliday, I think, was such a brilliant actress. She's gone way too soon, died of cancer at a young age, and only has a handful of movies. But each one, she brought so many layers to her characters, and that is so apparent in Born Yesterday. It was a role that she originated on the stage, but she had to fight to be cast in that, and then she had to really fight to be cast in the movie version because Harry Cohn at Columbia wanted a bigger star name, or a star name like Rita Hayworth. He didn't want to take a chance on a theater actress. And everyone else was on her side, including the director, George Cukor, who said, okay, well, Harry Cohn won't let you screen test for the role. So how about I cast you in a role in Adam's Rib? And that was at MGM, a different studio. And we used that as sort of your screen test. And even Katharine Hepburn got involved and said, in this one shot, I think you should just stay on Judy's face so that she can really show what she can do as an actress. And that ended up winning her the role on Born Yesterday. And then she ends up winning the Oscar. So she was at this event for the Oscars in New York, sitting next to Gloria Swanson, not thinking that she was going to win at all. Gloria was really excited to be there. She turned to Judy and said, one of us is going to be really happy. And then I love this story. This is according to Judy. Judy's name was announced. She was shocked. She got all these congratulations. Then Gloria Swanson called her over and whispered something in her ear that changed her face from a smile to a frown. You know, she looked suddenly quite sad. And later on, she said that Gloria had told her, you know, why couldn't you have waited another year? Why did you have to win in this year? And so she felt really bad that she had won against Gloria, because Gloria knew this was her final chance for an Oscar. But I still think that it went to the right person, because she was so brilliant as Billy Dawn, this chorus girl who gets an education, sort of Pygmalion type story with William Holden. But she brought so much to that role.
Yes, thank you for really giving the people that background, because it's such a
I just
fascinating
love that story. Yeah,
yeah, it really is, and that's a year that people can be opinionated about in terms of did she deserve to win. Gloria Swanson there, Bette Davis there, Anne Baxter has her fans, Eleanor Parker has her fans, so it's like, yeah, very much looking forward to breaking down that year. Not gonna lie.
Yeah, that's gonna be an interesting one.
Yes. Well, my other question for you is, what would you say is your most heartbreaking loss in Best Actress, where maybe one of your faves was nominated, but somehow they just didn't make it?
Well, this is probably also going to be controversial, because this is one year that everyone talks about in terms of Best Actress, and that was Grace Kelly winning for The Country Girl and Judy Garland losing for A Star Is Born. Of course, Audrey Hepburn was also nominated for Sabrina. You had Dorothy Dandridge for Carmen Jones, and Jane Wyman for Magnificent Obsession, a film that I just love because I love Douglas Sirk melodramas. But for me, I do feel like Judy Garland deserved to win that year. This was, again, another kind of comeback role after she'd been dropped by MGM Studios, the place that she called home for a long time since she was a teenager. She was struggling personally, but she managed to bring it all back together. She helped to produce the film of A Star Is Born. She had to deal with a lot of issues from the studio wanting to cut the runtime, and they just cut out chunks of her performance, but she is still so touching when you see her in that role. And of course now people know it more as a role for Lady Gaga, but this was the second version of A Star Is Born. And I think Judy brought a lot of her vulnerability and the personal struggles that she had to her role as a star on the rise. She could obviously empathize with the star on the decline, you know, played by James Mason. So I think she really should have won then. She won the honorary juvenile award in 1940 when they used to give out those for her role in The Wizard of Oz, but she never won a competitive Oscar, and I think that was a shame. And I love the fact that that she got a telegram from Groucho Marx afterwards saying it was the biggest robbery since Brinks that she didn't win in that year at the Oscars.
Yes. You're not the first person on this show to give that answer, and it certainly won't be the last, for a reason. You know, I understand why it's such a common answer, and I happen to agree, so that is excellent. All right, well, let's jump in and talk about this year at the Oscars, the 13th Academy Awards. The nominees were Bette Davis for The Letter, Joan Fontaine for Rebecca, Katharine Hepburn for The Philadelphia Story, Ginger Rogers for Kitty Foyle, and Martha Scott for Our Town, with the winner being Ginger Rogers. So before we break down these performances on an individual level, curious your overall thoughts on this lineup.
I think there's not a bad performance here. Rewatching all of the films, I just thought they're each special in their own way, and they each showcase a part of this particular actress that she was able to bring to the role. So I think it's hard to choose a favorite amongst them because they're very different. I mean, Bette Davis in The Letter, that's such a different performance to Katharine Hepburn in The Philadelphia Story. But I really do love each of these performances.
Yeah, I really like this lineup a lot. You know, we do have performances and in films that have really stood the test of time, like
Mm-hmm.
Rebecca, like The Philadelphia Story, The Letter. I mean, almost everyone here was also a big star or a star who was very much on the rise. And what I also love is that we have something we don't always get, which is that all five of these Best Actress nominees are in films that are also nominated for Best Picture.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, for the most part, they totally dominate their films. The films are really about them and their journeys. Even if they have male co leads, the story is very much their perspective. So, yeah, and you're
Yeah,
right that this is
absolutely.
a lineup where no two performances can really even be considered even similar to each other, which is great.
Yes.
So, yeah, I'm very positive on this lineup. I do have one exception, which we'll get to, but we'll talk it out.
Okay.
I'm
I look
I'm
forward to
happy that you're
hearing.
here to help me break down these icons. So, ready to jump
Yeah.
in?
Yeah, I'm ready.
All right, let's go in alphabetical order here, starting with the legendary Bette Davis for The Letter. So, this is Bette Davis's her fourth official nomination, fifth if you want to count the write-in situation for Of Human Bondage.
Mm-hmm.
But she's really on a hot streak here. This is her third nomination in a row. She's already won 2 Oscars by this point, so she's one of the most popular, most in-demand actresses in Hollywood at this time. And this is her reuniting with William Wyler after he directed her to one of her wins for Jezebel. And the two of them worked very well together, even if sometimes they fought, which they did on this film, actually. And for those who listened to the first season, you'll recall that there was a version of The Letter starring Gene Eagles at the second Academy Awards. She was nominated posthumously for that performance. And here we have Betty playing the exact same role of Leslie Crosby. The story is that she shoots and kills her lover at the start of the story, and she claims that it was self-defense, and people generally believe her until there's this letter that shows up, the titular letter, that proves that she had requested that he come there for the night, even though she claimed that she didn't really know him very well. And so this letter is in the possession of this dead man's wife, who in this version of the story is a Eurasian woman played by Gail Sondergaard, a previous supporting actress winner. And she wants Leslie to give her $10,000 in exchange for the letter. So she goes and does it, and Leslie is ultimately acquitted, but things kind of start to unravel from there. So, first of all, Alicia, had you seen that other version of the letter before this?
No, I hadn't. I saw this one first because it
Mm-hmm.
was one of the early Bette Davis performances that I saw,
Yeah.
I think, sometime when I was a teenager or maybe in my early 20s. And it wasn't for a long time that I saw the Gene Eagles version. I can't quite even remember it, but I know that Bette Davis was very captivated by that performance. And so she was
Mm-hmm.
very keen to take this on. And Warner Brothers had bought the rights to the letter, this Somerset Maugham story that was also a play, and bought it for her. And I think that she brought just all of her talents to this role. I think she's so compelling as Leslie Crosby. You sort of can't take your eyes away from her. You know, you just want to look at her face.
Yeah, absolutely. And as listeners of this show have heard the first season, that they know that I'm a big Bette Davis fan, especially when she was in parts like this that really, really suited her. Because it didn't always happen, but this one I think really fits her like a glove. I think she was really just the preeminent actress at this time who the studios would go to if the protagonist of the film was, you know, a more villainous woman, or at the very least a complicated woman who was
Yes.
acting in her own self-interest.
Yes. That was something that she and William Wyler fought about. Was he wanted to do reshoots to make sure that her character was more sympathetic to the audience. And she said
Mm-hmm.
no, Bette Davis, because she said you're going to lose the complexity, and we should treat the audience with intelligence and know that they can come up with their own ideas about Leslie. And one of the things that I love about her performance is that she really plays with this idea of who is Leslie? Is she telling the truth? Is she not telling the truth? She's very quick to come up with a story, and it all sounds so perfect. She's got a great memory, and she loves the detail with the lace work. And I think Bette Davis is so good at playing these characters who have so much going on, so many layers to them, that on one hand, she's done this horrible thing and it's very selfish. On the other hand, she is so passionate. She was in love with him. And you just never know whether to root for her or not. And I love characters that make you question yourself about whether you should be caring about them or not.
Oh yeah, she specialized in that very thing, I think.
Yeah.
And that opening scene, just from there, it's so beautifully constructed, first of all, with that establishing shot and sort of moving in to see this house and then hearing the gunshots and her just standing there after shooting this guy who's very clearly dead by this point, but she just keeps shooting anyway. And there's just like this resolve in her eyes that's really chilling, I think. Like, this is not something that happened by mistake or in the heat of the moment. Like, this is true, like, confidence in the decision she's made. And I love that she owns it, and she doesn't even paint it like, you know, she's just crazy or she's just overcome with emotion. Like, it's very cold, and it's such a memorable opening scene that just really, I think, really sets the tone for exactly who this person is.
It really does. She has a defiance in her eye, but then you question whether she did it in self-defense or not later on, because she's so convincing when she tells the story. But that long shot is such a great way to open the movie, and such a great way to set the singing and the mood and to bring you into this world, you know, being in this plantation and where everything is situated, the moon. And I know that Hal Wallace, the producer, got really frustrated because William Wyler, who of course famously loved to shoot many takes, insisted on doing that opening scene 33 times. And Bette Davis was getting tired.
Yeah.
They said the extra who played the guy on the ground, you know, who got shot, you had to keep keeping his tuxedo free of dust. There was just the white cockatoo had to come back in. There was so much going on within that one shot, but that was the brilliance of William Wyler, is that even though he demanded a lot, it was always about the end product and how it would turn out in the end. And that's why he and Bette Davis worked so well together, because she was also a perfectionist. So I don't think she minded doing things multiple times.
Right. I think it was all about the end result.
Yes.
You know, so. But yeah, even like before she's about to be turned over to the police, when she's being questioned in her house, the way she's sort of explaining what happened, or at least, I guess, inventing the story of what happened, and she just darts her eyes around the room very slightly to see like what the reaction is, you know. I think she's just so connected in that moment, and you can imagine like other actresses maybe playing it in a way that's a little bit more dazed or like really leaning into the sort of detachment from reality. But this is, again, it's a woman who knows what she's doing. She knows how to manipulate people, especially men. And that's a part of you as an audience member that is so fascinated by her that you almost want to see how much she can get away with, because she just commands so much of your attention right away.
Yeah, and it's one of those great films that it becomes more apparent in a rewatch, because the first time you see it, you aren't really sure whether she did it on purpose or in self-defense. But then once you see it, and you can go back and you can notice all of the little moments that Bette Davis weaved in there, I think it reveals itself even more a second time. And another little battle that she had with William Wyler was over that line of with all my heart I still love the man I killed. And so Davis and Wyler sort of had a battle about whether she should look her husband in the eye or not, or if that was too cruel. But she decided to, in the end, I think Wyler won, and she had to look him in the eye and say, I still love the man I killed. And then even like years and years later, when Wyler was doing the tribute to her at the AFI, he said, I think she still wants to go and reshoot that scene. And she was like, yep, I want to go and do it my way.
Yeah, I mean, I actually do agree with her on that, you know?
It does feel quite cruel in the moment, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think sort of what we get is kind of less nuanced than what Betty probably imagined and probably what attracted her to the story. So I'm Team Betty on that one, not gonna lie. But one other scene I wanted to highlight is when she's been in the jail for a few days, and the detective is revealing to her that he has the letter, and we see this a little bit of a flash of panic in her eyes because, you know, it's sort of something that she can't control, and the way she just stares at him and says, and she's just like, I did not write that letter, and she's like coming up with excuses like, oh, the letter, it's not dated, you know, that he actually eventually says like what's on it, and she realizes that she can't really get out of this, and she is like starting to breathe in this very labored way, which is a really nice touch. And she's like, okay, so maybe I did write it, and sort of comes up with another excuse about how she invited this guy over because they were planning like a surprise party for her husband, and the lies are just spiraling out of control at this point. But she really manages to just keep her composure through so much of it in this way that's like it's kind of sociopathic. And it's like she will just say whatever is necessary to save herself. She will literally bankrupt her own husband without telling him to save herself. And yeah, it's just like a force of nature to watch this woman just sort of get away with so much.
Yeah, and figuring it all out in real time of,
Right.
okay, so what are my options now? How do I get around that? And you quickly realize, okay, you can't trust anything she says. And then you feel sorry for her husband, and you also see how she was able to pull the wool over his eyes for so long and carry on this affair because she's so good at lying. And she doesn't seem to
Right.
feel any remorse for her lies. She's just so convincing when she says it. I thought we mentioned the lace before, and I think that's such a nice touch to the character, that she is happy doing this kind of repetitive, detailed work. And it seems like that takes a lot of concentration, and that's something that she is very good at when it comes to lying. She's, you know, she says, oh, my memory is not that good, but it really is, because she remembers her lies. She, like they said, her story never changed to the police, even though it was something that she might have come up with in the moment. She remembers it word for word.
Mm-hmm. It's like she's almost convinced herself of her own lies.
Yes.
Yeah. I do also want to mention a little bit about one of the more perhaps dated aspects of the story, and especially this adaptation of the story, which is just the depiction of Chinese characters, especially the widow, kind of stereotypical. And we have Gail Sondergaard here, who is very much a white woman playing a Eurasian woman as this sort of like snake type of character. And the way she's depicted here is almost like not really that human. It's a very odd choice. I mean, even though I think this is an interesting dimension to the story, where it's, you know, Leslie is this white woman who is using her status to literally get away with murder, and we've seen that she has this prejudice against Asians, it seems like. I think there's even a moment where she talks about the widow's eyes or something like that, and sort of comparing her to a snake. But I actually do think Betty adds some interesting stuff there to her character, and the scene where she meets the widow, where again she is not sure how this whole scene is going to go down. She doesn't have control over the situation. There's something very subtle and well done in that scene, where I think, you know, the widow wants Leslie to sort of beg for forgiveness and show that what she did was wrong, but it doesn't seem like Leslie's really able to go there, and that's, I am assuming, what leads the widow to feeling like there's still some unfinished business between the two of them. But Yeah, I know
'cause
I tackled a lot there, but did you have any thoughts
No,
on this part of the story?
Yeah, when you watch her and she's sort of down on her knees and looking up at the wife, but you don't see any remorse in her eyes. It's
Right.
almost like a fascination. She's trying to figure out, okay, so what do you have that I didn't have? How did he love you? And I agree that also led to her death in the end. Of course, also the production code led to that, because that was not the way the story ended originally. But obviously, in those times, you couldn't have adultery and murder go unpunished in a film. So she had to die in the end to make up for her sins, so they can show that crime doesn't pay. But it is really unfortunate when it comes to the casting of Gail Sondergaard. And of course, this happened so much during classic Hollywood, and Asian Americans and Asian characters and actors in general really got the short end of the stick. They weren't able to become stars because they weren't able to get opportunities. And Weiler talked about, well, who else could I have cast? Like maybe Anna May Wong, but she was too young at the time. And it's like, well, maybe someone else,
Yeah.
But that was the way of old Hollywood. They thought, oh, well, yellow face makeup or this kind of exotic woman, that's near enough. And it's a real shame. But she does a good job with the role that she's given, Gail. But as you said, there's not a whole lot to her character for us to understand where she's coming from.
Mm-hmm. It feels much more like caricature to me.
Yeah.
But with this ending, yes, it feels very much like a studio note.
Yes. Although I do like the how the shot goes from her body on the ground, it cranes up, and then you see the dancing is continuing. So like the ball, the dance, it just continues on even though she's dead right there.
Yeah, it feels like it ends on a more decisive note than the 1929 version, which was pre-code, which is actually ambiguous, I think, and leaves you with this sense that she's going to have to live on this plantation forever, and she's kind of like in this prison of her own making almost, which I think is more interesting than the ending we get here, to be honest, but I get the context, obviously.
Yeah, you got to tie it up in a nice neat bow in 1940.
Exactly. So one thing I'm doing with this show is reading a handful of reviews from the time period just to get a sense of what they were saying about these performances at the time. One of them I found from the New York Times was interesting. It said, Miss Davis is a strangely cool and calculating killer who conducts herself with reserve and yet implies a deep confusion of emotions.
Confusion of emotions. That's good. Yeah. I agree.
Yeah, and also Variety says Davis's frigidity at times seems to go even beyond the characterization, which feels pointed, but
yeah, it feels very pointed.
Yeah,
Ouch.
Yeah, just an interesting mix of opinions. I feel like a lot of critics were sort of struggling to wrap their arms around this character, and the way they sort of discussed her in it was odd. Like they didn't quite know exactly how to, she has this reputation of playing these kinds of characters, and maybe some critics felt like this is becoming more of a type perhaps for her.
Yeah, and I think there was a lot of resistance at the time to any female character that wasn't easily identifiable, easily put in a box of being likable or unlikable. It's kind of like, tell us what we're supposed to think about this woman doing these terrible things.
Right. I don't know how to feel and it's making me crazy. Yeah. I also found this from Pauline Kael, which was not at the time, but later on, how she said that Davis gives what is very likely the best study of female sexual hypocrisy in film history. A very bold statement. But I can see it. Yeah.
I can see it too.
Yes. Okay, so anything else on Bette before we move on?
No, just that she was really kind of hard to fault in this role when it comes to her acting talent. Yeah.
I completely agree. One of her best. All right, so let's move on to Joan Fontaine in Rebecca. So we have our first new face here, Joan Fontaine, sister of Olivia de Havilland, of course, and she was in a handful of films before this. Her first proper role was in a movie called The Man Who Found Himself in 1937. She was actually the star of a few comedies. She was in The Women, and really all along she was being touted as here comes the next big star, but she really didn't have anything up to this point that brought her to that true star level until Rebecca.
Yes, absolutely. This was pretty early on in her career. She had been in a couple of minor roles with RKO, where she signed her first contract. I just rewatched the other day Quality Street with Katharine Hepburn, and Joan Fontaine plays a very small part in that, but that was one of her earliest roles, her first film at RKO. And Hepburn actually saw something special in her. This is a running theme, apparently, with who I'm talking about.
So.
But Hepburn actually went to the RKO front office and said, you should start casting her in lead parts in B movies so that she can start getting more training, because I think she will be a star. And Joan Fontaine later said that was great training for her to be in these B roles. But she had been fired from RKO. She was still very unsure of herself, insecure. But that really helped Alfred Hitchcock, because that's exactly who she needed to be as the new Mrs. De Winter in this film.
Yeah. And the story goes that she was, I guess, seated next to the producer David O. Selznick at a dinner party, and he told her to audition, and it was another very highly sought after role, sort of like what we were talking about with Scarlett O'Hara. Not quite to that extent, but it was certainly something that was a hot property, and she went through a whole bunch of screen tests before she finally got this part. And let's just jump right into the story. She plays a young woman who is not actually named in the story, but she is referred to as the second Mrs. De Winter. She meets Mr. De Winter, Maxim, played by Laurence Olivier, who is this widower, and he marries her, and she comes to inhabit this huge mansion called Manderley, where he used to live with his previous wife, Rebecca, of course, who died. And they have a housekeeper, Mrs. Danvers, who is very attached to Rebecca. And a lot of the film is the second Mrs. De Winter trying to be comfortable in this new setting, and also having this housekeeper here who's judging her, and her husband who tends to lash out at her at unexpected points. And eventually it's revealed that perhaps he had something to do with Rebecca's death. Excellent film, Alfred Hitchcock. It wins Best Picture, 11 nominations, and this is one of those cases actually where someone is nominated in Best Actress while the film wins Best Picture, but she does not end up winning. And a lot of people say that maybe her win the next year for Suspicion is a makeup for them not giving it to her for Rebecca. So what do you think? What is your relationship to Rebecca in this performance from her?
Well, firstly, apologies if you hear some purrs. My cat just jumped on my lap, and I'm giving her a little chin scratch. Her name is Miss Hayworth, because she's a beautiful ginger.
Of course.
Well, I really love Joan Fontaine here, because I think she suited this role perfectly. As we said, she was insecure at this time. This was her as a new actress, a newish actress, in front of a group of veterans. Hitchcock, as he often did, he took full advantage of her insecurities to bring out a performance in her. So he apparently would tell her that nobody liked her on set, that she didn't deserve to have this role, that her husband at the time, Brian Aherne, well, she could have done better than him. She really just fed her insecurities, because that was who she needed to be as this second Mrs. De Winter. And also she had a hard time because Laurence Olivier really wanted to cast Vivien Leigh in this role, and as he often did, and she often did, insist on having each other in the films that they were in. So he was kind of quite resentful that Joan Fontaine got this role. But I think she is so good, because she's she's just so squirmy and so unsure of herself, and makes herself quite small in the room, and just completely believable as this fish out of water, this girl. And you just want to give her a hug or say it's okay, and you don't have to live up to this figure that we never see of Rebecca, who looms over the whole film. You don't have to live up to this woman, you just have to be yourself. But you feel bad for her because she's left on her own and left to deal with this whole mansion and this world that she doesn't know about. But I thought she brought that perfectly to the screen.
Yeah, this is one of those roles that is so much more complicated than it looks, I think.
Yeah.
Because she's playing a woman who literally doesn't even have an identity beyond being the wife of Mr. De Winter. We don't know her first name. We don't know too much about anything about her background. And the role is also requiring her to be very reactive. And I think actually it's the kind of performance that has a lot in common with what we would see in horror movies, which you could maybe classify this as horror, psychological thriller. And, you know, as we know full well, horror performances do not get nominated for Oscars very often. But I think part of what maybe elevates this to something that the Oscars just really couldn't ignore is how much emotion she brings to it. I think there's a version of this that maybe overplays how scared she is, or is just maybe not all that compelling because of how little is on the page for her. But I think she really puts in the work to make you care about her, and you do just sort of want to reach through the screen and say like it's okay. Yeah.
It's okay. And I feel bad for you that your husband's kind of just left you in this big house. But I totally agree with that. I think it could have been, you're not as subtle and nuanced in someone else's hands. And I also like the way that she changes throughout. So you do see her, you get more confident. You know, that Mr. De Winter, Maxim, was always talking about her getting older, you know, you losing that kind of youthful naivete that she had. And you see that in her performance as well. You see her gaining confidence in herself by the end, but she hasn't changed to the point where you don't believe that change. It's a very believable journey for her. And I think she did a great job as being, you know, the center of the film and every scene. And she's the one that really carries us through the story.
Totally. And, you know, in the beginning, she's very innocent. There's something almost wistful and a little bit just like different feeling about her. She is a very striking person. So you could see why that he would be drawn to her, because and this is not meant as an insult, but I think the energy that Joan Fontaine projects in the film is sort of like he's able to project whatever he wants onto her. Like she doesn't have a super distinct personality like a Bette Davis or a Katharine Hepburn or even a Vivien Leigh. And I think that's kind of part of why, even though this guy clearly has a lot of baggage that he's dealing with, he sort of finds himself really seeing her as kind of a second chance, like a second chance at love. And from her perspective, like, he's charming, he's handsome, he treats her well, at least in the beginning. And everything that happens at Manderley is a whole other story. But in those opening scenes, I think she just has this really nice chemistry with Laurence Olivier, and they look great together. And you could see for both of them, I think, how they might think maybe this is the one, you know? But there is one line that I took note of here on this rewatch after he proposes to her, and she just says, "I'm not the sort of person you marry," which sets up this feeling, I think, that she already feels kind of inferior to Maxim and this kind of rich upper class that he's a part of. So yes. I thought that was laying the groundwork nicely for her, and the way she performs that is very innocent and like,
it's pretty
she genuinely believes that. Yeah,
it's quite heartbreaking that she doesn't think that she's good enough to be there, and she very much allows his world to overwhelm her, and she doesn't want to do anything different to how the first Mrs. De Winter ran the house. Of course, Mrs. Danvers is such a intimidating figure that does not help her at all. And the way that everyone treats her of like, oh, she's hiding behind the door, or what does the mistress want? I mean, it just makes her even more insecure about herself and about what Maxim wants. And I think Maxim saw her and just saw how rare it was to have this kind of innocence, that he doesn't see in his world. And maybe almost something that he wants for himself, or he wants to be able to hold on to with having her in his life. But as he kind of later says, it's quite a selfish thing to do, to marry her and just drop her into this world without holding her hand through it, because it was such a big change in her life.
Yeah, I mean, and we see it right away in the scene where she meets Mrs. Danvers, which is great because, you know, there's certainly like the lighting and the very tense music and all the craft elements that show how like these two are definitely going to have conflict. But I think what Joan does in this scene is that she shows that she's a little bit thrown off by this situation, but that there's also kind of part of her that is willing to give people the benefit of the doubt, you know, even if she gets the sense that maybe she's not exactly welcome here. But there's still that little bit of hope that she has that maybe she can, you know, adjust to this and make it through. But
yes,
it's hard. It's hard to go up against all the obstacles that she has to come across.
I know, and particularly with Mrs. Danvers, with the way that she, and of course we can go into that of what exactly her relationship was with Rebecca, but the way that she constantly brings her up and compares, you know, the second Mrs. De Winter to her. It's just not setting her up for a good time in that house, and it very much feels like Mrs. Danvers' house, not the second, you know, Joan Fontaine's character's house.
Right, very much a ghost in the house, for sure. And I think one of the more memorable scenes is when she gets the phone call at the desk and she answers the phone and the other person is looking for Mrs. De Winter and she's immediately like, oh, Mrs. De Winter is dead. And
she's like, oh, wait, that's
hangs
me.
Up. And just that look of shock on her
like,
face when she's like, oh, right.
I just love the way that she, you know, she accidentally breaks the china and then tries to stuff it in the drawer and hides it behind all the letters in a panic. And then later on, they're just like, why didn't you just say that you did it? And you completely understand her motivation when she's trying to do her best and trying to hide her things, you know, things that she thinks she's done wrong. You understand why she feels that way.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I love so many of the scenes in the middle portion here of her just exploring the mansion, and like when she's eavesdropping on Maxim's sister and her husband, and she's kind of futzing around with her hands, and you can see just how uncomfortable she is here, and she's so desperate to just have things run smoothly, just like have one good day for once.
Exactly.
Not upset anyone.
I love about her performance, you know, like I said, it was squirmy. It's like her hands are always moving. She's always sort of shifting. She's just not like standing still. She's just fidgeting all the time. And it's that kind of subtlety to her character that makes you just feel that she's always uneasy. She's never just completely comfortable in her own skin.
Right. It's like really watching someone be put through the ringer on this psychological level in a way that's actually reminds me of what Ingrid Bergman would do in Gaslight. You know, someone who's just in a very bad situation. Herself. Yeah. Who's being manipulated and she's being mocked and she's just made to feel lesser than by pretty much everyone around her. And you want her to be okay. You want to tell her that she's not crazy to be feeling this way. And what I also love is that she doesn't infantilize her, really. She doesn't really dumb her down in the sense of like, oh, here's this woman who's running around the mansion and she has no idea what's going on. I think this could almost be played for laughs if she went too over the top with it, you know, like we were saying. But she really seems to have a real, just like a respect for this character and this journey that she's on. So I think that's part of why you do root for her.
Absolutely. And I'm not sure if you saw the remake that came out. I think it was last year. Yeah, I didn't think that the remake captured her unease quite as much as Joan Fontaine did in this version.
No, it did not. didn't quite live up to this, which is a masterpiece in my opinion.
Hitchcock.
Yeah,
I know, and
it
it's
wasn't
funny
a
that
direct remake, but it's like an adaptation of the book, but still.
Exactly, and Hitchcock had to make a very faithful adaptation of the book because he was required to by Selznick, and so he didn't really deviate much from Daphne du Maurier's story, and he, because of that and because of the lack of humor, he didn't really see this as being a great Hitchcock picture. Later on, to Francois Truffaut, he said that it stood up quite well over the years. I don't know why. That's hard to imagine because we can see what a masterpiece it was, one of his many masterpieces. But I also love this quote. This is not to do with Joan Fontaine, but I just wanted to mention it because it made me laugh. That he said when he arrived, when I came to America to direct Rebecca, David Selznick sent me a memo. I've just finished reading it. I think I may turn it into a motion picture. I plan to call it The Longest Story Ever Told.
Yeah.
He had to deal with so much instruction from David O. Selznick.
Yeah, I think that's probably part of why he feels like not as on board, ironically, as, people who actually love the film. It's just dealing with all the behind the scenes stuff there. Yeah.
But Selznick, this was his second Best Picture Oscar, wasn't it, in a row?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. He was riding high after these 2 years, for sure. There's also this other great moment, I think, for her when they're in front of the projector, I think, and she just mentions something about gossip, and he snaps at her. And she's just so desperate to just like try to salvage the situation. And she's just fully terrified, walking on eggshells, and she doesn't know what to do about it. Like, it actually reminds me a little bit of what we were talking about with Barbara Stanwyck and Stella Dallas, where towards the end of that film, she just wants what's best for her daughter. And she doesn't understand why her daughter is embarrassed by her. And it's just like this really heartbreaking situation. Obviously this is a very different dynamic, but I think just the emotion of it is so palpable for the audience. Like, you really feel for her.
In Stella Dallas, through that moment where she's looking into the window and standing outside, such a heartbreaking moment. And here with Joan Fontaine, when he's like, never mind, and he sort of turns the projector back on, and you can see that she's worried that it's going to be over completely, their marriage, and she's caught in the flickering lights, and she seems like she's sort of caught up against the wall, almost like a deer in headlights. She's like, what did I just say? What did I do? Have I ruined it all? What's going to happen to me? I love him. And it is a heartbreaking moment. And I love the next scene or two where she realizes and she finds sort of that joy, and she runs to him, Maxim, I missed you, and you see that joy come back to her.
Right. There's truly so many scenes that we can highlight here, but all of just her one thing I do love is just all her reactions in the scene where Mrs. Danvers really is going overboard about how much she loves Rebecca, and she's just sort of silently reacting to it and seems very scared about this woman who seems unhinged, all the way through her wearing Rebecca's dress. And she's just like terrified about his reaction to that. Truly so much of it is just in her face and her body language. She doesn't even have to say much for you to understand everything that she's feeling.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I think this is a great performance by Joan Fontaine. And I think that she's a big reason why the film remains a favorite for so many people, myself included. Although it is hard to find, I have to say. But the good thing about doing this podcast was like, now I have an excuse to buy it on Criterion, because it's one of those films that is not available for streaming.
Yeah, which is a shame. It deserves the wider treatment. But yes, it's a very lovely transfer on the Criterion. Just plugging that. But it's interesting that we get to the point in the film where, Rebecca's body resurfaces and Maxim is just forced to tell the truth, and she's really seeing her husband in a new light. And I think that's also part of why she transitions into this a little bit different version of herself, where she wants to protect her husband from, getting in trouble with the authorities, and seems like she's matured. She's taking on a slightly different demeanor. And the reason why she does this, I think it's sort of left up to our interpretation, but what she does is really switch up her body language from here on out. Like, she seems more confident in what she's doing. And I think, if I'm being honest, I think the movie does slightly abandon her as it starts to focus on Maxim in this last part, which can sort of shortchange the performance a little bit in the end. But I mean, overall, I really think she does so much with a role that could really be weaker, I think, in another actress's hands. So
yeah, and I think I like the way that she, as Joan Fontaine, portrayed the change, because like I said, there's a shift in body language. The way I read it too is that she finally has the confidence that he loves her for her, and that she doesn't have to try to be someone else, that she can be the love of his life. So then she has more of a confidence in who she is, but at the same time she's still fragile. We see her faint. She's worried about her husband, and it's also kind of a nice surprise when you first see the film that she's just like, oh, thank God, I'm glad that you hated her. She doesn't really question, like, hang on, is he telling the truth? Did he kill her because he wanted to kill her? I kind of like that she was just totally on board with supporting him, even though he's just revealed this horrible secret to her.
Exactly. But I think, in general, this is a film that people have talked about and have said, oh, Laurence Olivier, great performance. Obviously, the Judith Anderson performance is pretty iconic as Mrs. Danvers. But I really think she is just really the heart and soul of the film, that if you don't have this performance at the center, it doesn't work. So.
Absolutely. I think it's just easy to overlook because it is, it is so full of insecurity. It's you just have to realize that this is everything that she's doing as an actress. Intentional. And that was nothing like she was in Suspicion or any of her other films.
Right. So the New York Times, their review of her performance is very glowing. They say, Miss de Maurier never really convinced me anyone could behave quite as the second Mrs. de Winter behaved and still be sweet, modest, attractive, and alive. But Miss Fontaine does it. And does it not simply with her eyes, her mouth, her hands, and her words, but with her spine. Possibly it's unethical to criticize performance anatomically. Still, we insist Miss Fontaine has the most expressive spine and shoulders we've bothered to notice this season. So
I mean, it's a weird way of describing it, but I totally agree, because I noticed that she was hunching, and she was just, and again, it's just that idea of making yourself small and unseen in this big, overwhelming house. And I thought that was just a nice touch, but it's just weird to talk about her spine.
Yeah, in the New York Times. Yeah. Moving on. Do you have anything else about Joan?
No, I just love the performance. And again, watching it was a treat.
Yes, absolutely. I think she just reveals new layers with each rewatch for me. Yes. So, all right. Well, let's move on to a very different kind of performance here with Katharine Hepburn for The Philadelphia Story. All right, so here we are again with Katharine Hepburn, and this is a big one for her, not just, in the sense that this is one of her most beloved films, but also because this was a turning point for her in her career. She already won an Oscar. She was nominated again a few years later, but then after that, she had quite a few not so successful films, which labeled her the dreaded box office poison. And she was very aware of that, so she essentially just took charge of the situation, really, and really tried to right the ship again. and she signed on to this Broadway play, Philadelphia Story, which was written with her in mind. So she did that. It was a huge hit, and she actually got the rights to the film for the adaptation, I mean. And just like as part of her deal, she also got to choose the director, George Cukor, plus her co-stars, Cary Grant, Jimmy Stewart. So, she makes this film adaptation. It's a big hit, and she's essentially back in Hollywood's good graces again. So it's an interesting backstory.
It's very interesting backstory, and interesting to look at her performance within that context, because being labeled box office poison, she realized that she had lost touch with the audience. She said, the audience thinks I'm too la-di-da or something. The audience really wasn't connecting to these kind of madcap heiress characters she played in Holiday and also in Bringing Up Baby, which wasn't a hit at the time, even though now it's revered as one of the best screwball comedies of all time. But she knew that she had to do something to win the audience back, and that she knew that the way to do that was to knock herself off the pedestal. She saw that the audience thought that she was just too high and mighty, and with her breeding and her mannerisms. And so she saw the Philadelphia Story as being a great opportunity to win back the audience, unfortunately, by humbling herself. Because this character she plays of Tracy Lord, she is exactly as you would imagine Katharine Hepburn to be, but every person in the film, every character just throws these horrible barbs at her and just really brings her back down to earth. And when she was talking to George Cukor, as you said, her choice of director, she said, I think the audience really wants to see me fall on my face. And he said, or your ass. And that's how they came up with the opening scene, where Cary Grant shoves her in the face quite brutally, and she lands on her ass. And everybody loved that scene because we saw Katharine Hepburn falling on her butt.
Yeah. That's a very fun story. As far as the film, for those who don't know, I mean, it's a very well-known, popular film, but for context, it is about her, Tracy Lord, who is a socialite, and she's from a good family, and she gets the divorce from the Cary Grant character, which is C.K. Dexter Haven, which is a great name.
Great
and
name.
then she gets engaged to this new guy, George. And meanwhile, we have Jimmy Stewart coming in, playing Mike, who is this reporter who is assigned to cover this wedding of Tracy and George. So he goes there with his photographer, and also C.K. Dexter Haven goes there. And a lot of, as we say, chaos ensues. Love triangle, I guess, maybe love quadrangle in this case. But it's a good time. What do you actually make of her performance here?
Well, I think it's obviously so perfect for Katharine Hepburn. Like I said, it's exactly how you imagine her to be. It's a great example of the sort of mid-Atlantic, transatlantic accent that she had, that was very particular to her. She's wonderful at playing these kind of socialite heiress characters who are quite rich and have these breeding, and she talks about the ship being so and all of this, but she seems to have a lot of fun with the role too, and it's so enjoyable to watch her throughout this movie, because while it is a shame that she felt that she had to be humbled for the audience, she brought a lot of comedy to her role as well. I'm sure we'll talk about many of those scenes, but it's just so much fun to see her drink a lot of champagne and act drunk on the screen. And I think even though she wanted Spencer Tracy and Clark Gable, they were her first choices for her leading men. And of course, the guys who starred in the play with her, which is, I think, Van Heflin and Joseph Cotton, they were a little bit upset that she didn't want them for the film role. But of course, Cary Grant and Jimmy Stewart ended up just being such a wonderful, wonderful pair trio to kind of pair with her. And such a treat for any classic film fan to see those three together in the only film they co-starred in all together.
Yeah, and this is the last time that she worked with Cary Grant. I wish they did even more. But
I know, they're perfect with each other.
They
Because
really
they have
are.
that same kind of transatlantic affected accent that just works so well for their personas.
Right. And they have that rhythm, that very distinct, like
Yeah.
they're on the same wavelength, I think. But yeah, this is such a distinct performance for her. Not, that she's doing something that we haven't seen before, but how much this performance really comes to define everything we know about and know and love about Katharine Hepburn. And for some people, this is maybe prototypical of her, that it sort of crystallizes why they don't like her, which is fine. I get that she wasn't for everyone, but this is like a pure hit of Katharine Hepburn here.
Oh,
And
yes.
just the mid-Atlantic accent is in full force. The attitude, the way she just like modulates her voice at these odd points. Like she has just these odd line readings that, not in a bad way, but they're just like so like no other actress would think to emphasize certain words. But it's all there. And then you also have the more dramatic beats too, where you see that, this is not just a silly sort of frivolous kind of performance where like, even though this is considered a comedy, it's also touching on how she felt distance from her father, and she's embarrassed that he would cheat on her mother. And you can really hear the hurt in her voice as she's talking about him.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something I love about Katharine Hepburn is that, like, although she had the very particular way of speaking and mannerisms and sort of the athletic nature of her performances, she was capable of such deep emotion. I don't think anyone does the watery eye, quivery voice quite like Katharine
Yes.
Hepburn. She's so good when it comes to showing vulnerability, and especially in roles like this where she gives just that extra sort of hint of a layer of depth underneath this character, who at first you might think is quite frivolous and privileged and doesn't care about anyone and just is in her own world, and then you just get a sense of everything that's going on underneath there. And that's something she was so good at, just tipping the audience off that there's more to this character than meets the eye.
Oh yeah. And I actually wrote down this line from the film that really exemplifies that, which is, she says, I think it's to Jimmy Stewart, she says, "I believe you put the toughness down to save your skin. I know a little about that." And she says it so quietly compared to a lot of her other lines, but it's just really revealing about just who this woman is, how she pretends that she's okay, even though she's, I think, still hurting after this divorce, and she doesn't really want to marry George, but she's putting up this front, and I'm
Yes.
glad that the film gives her some moments of self-awareness, because otherwise a lot of this would just be sort of her floating through a room and sort of charming people with all these mannerisms, but not a lot of depth under that. But
yeah, and although she thought about it pragmatically, as in let's bring this character off her perch, and that will help to win back the audience. And it really worked, because one of the people involved in the Independent Theatres Association, who had created that box office poison list, after he saw the lines around the block to see Philadelphia Story, he said, "Come on back, Katie, all is forgiven." And so it really worked in terms of her being humbled for the audience, but it also gave her a chance to show more vulnerability to this character. And you see that every time someone says something horrible to her, to kind of knock through this tough layer that she's put up, her shield, and they kind of knock her through and bring her down, you see that it hurts. You see that it hurts her. I think that's something that's special about the performance.
Yeah, and really a lot of the stuff with her father is really interesting. We get these hints of it, especially when, like, doesn't he call her a prig at one point?
Yeah.
And it's just very brutal with her, and she's really hurt by his words, and he obviously comparing her to a statue at one point, which others have done,
Yes.
and is just saying, like, she doesn't have a heart. And I think in those little moments, she really dials back all those charms, and she's feeling very raw and vulnerable. And it's a little bit of what we see in Alice Adams too, where she's really having to sort of confront who she is as a person and is dealing with her own family. And it's these very tiny little moments and expressions on her face that are really filling in who this person is.
Yeah, absolutely. And even the scene when she gets drunk, I mean, it's fun to watch, and it leads to some funny moments, particularly with Jimmy Stewart. But you also get the sense that she's trying to figure it out. Like, so why does everyone think of me like this? And I'm fun. Hang on. Like, look, I've got more to me than just, I'm more than just that. I mean, look, I'm just going to have fun. But she's not really quite capable of doing that.
The scene of her getting drunk with Jimmy Stewart actually is probably the scene that I always remember most from the film, and the one I really just sort of associate this with. It's just like this one night of these two people who are connecting on this emotional level. And, you know, I think even though this whole film you could sort of classify as a romantic comedy, this whole sequence is where it feels like that first date rom-com moment. And I just love seeing her in this mode, who's just like totally uninhibited, and it's just really like that rom-com lead that you root for.
Yeah, and as she's trying to sort of figure out what's going on and how people see her, you also get the hints totally of how charming she is, how charming Tracy Lord is, and why men fall for her, because you can see it right there.
Right, and it leads to what the Jimmy Stewart character ultimately is saying about her. Like, there's so much in her eyes and in her spirit, like it's just like very glowing in his assessment of her, and you believe that because that's what she does sort of exude.
I also love the scene with Jimmy Stewart and Cary Grant when Jimmy Stewart is drunk and they ad-libbed that line where Jimmy Stewart hiccups and Cary Grant says, "Excuse me." Like, that was a total ad-lib. And I just love their dynamic in that moment.
Yeah, there's so many little moments here. Another great moment is when her sister is singing and playing the piano, and she just bursts into the room speaking French.
Yeah.
And she's like throwing the word smallpox around in this big sort of flurry of French, and it sort of causes Jimmy Stewart to back up a little bit.
Yeah. It's like, what's going on?
Right. And the whole scene after that of her really like grilling him and Ruth Hussey about like who they are and where they came from, and just being very pretentious and kind of laying it on thick. Yeah, all these little moments.
Yeah, and it's what, there's so much to enjoy. Again, like I said, I really don't see a bad performance in this bunch because they all have a lot going on. And this, your Philadelphia story, like you said, some people don't like it, or some people I've shown who aren't into classic films, it almost feels like a parody because it's exactly how you imagine a classic film to be, and the way people are talking, and so it's hard for some people to get used to. But when you really dive into it, there's a lot more happening than just, as you say, a romantic comedy. There's more in there. And I think, you know, Donald Ogden Stewart, who obviously won the Oscar for adapting the screenplay from the Philip Barry play, I think he was known for his dialogue, and he brought a lot to it, of course, as well as Philip Barry's original work.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really rich material, and is really juggling so many different characters and storylines, and it all comes together really well. Going back to the rom-com moment with her and Jimmy Stewart, that great part where she's just too drunk to even walk, so he's just carrying her through the yard, and he's singing Somewhere Over the Rainbow, and which was like a very modern hit at that time. But you know, and she's just like carrying her through the yard, and everyone is there, and she's like, "Hello, Dexter. Hello, George. Hello, Michael," and she sort of changes up her delivery on each of those names. Is like exactly why I love watching a Katharine Hepburn performance.
I know, I love when she's hungover as well.
Yes. And like not remembering exactly what happened last night. Like what? Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know about you, Kevin, but I kind of wanted her and Jimmy Stewart to end up together.
I know. I think the movie sort of feels like
perfect.
Yeah. Again, I love that scene between the two of them. And it does sort of feel like with Cary Grant, it's a little bit backgrounded, that relationship, and it's very under the radar, and they trade their barbs with each other throughout. But yeah, I would agree in generally that I did want her to end up with him.
Yeah.
But, in the end, she gets to be with probably the person who understands her the most, I guess, and she feels like a human being, rather than this goddess who's on a pedestal, and she feels so much lighter in her body language. So yeah, I mean, what's great is that even though this isn't like a big transformational performance from her, it's just her in pure movie star mode, just fully leaning into all of her strengths. And I think she really just cements this as the standard for at least this era of her career.
Yeah, and I think it's just, again, it's something that I so admire about her is her business acumen and the way that she was able to negotiate for what she wanted and orchestrate her own comeback to Hollywood on her own terms. And of course, she went on the following year to sell Woman of the Year as well. Right. So she ended up being able to sell these properties to MGM. And I also love the story of when she went to talk to Louis B. Mayer about making this film. And she said, I put on my highest heels because, of course, Louis B. Mayer was not that tall. So she was ready to, just dominate him and ask for exactly what she wanted. And she got it. She got the salary she wanted. She got the choice to choose the director and the actors. And she got to have this movie that she knew and was her comeback. And the Oscar, I'm sure, was an icing on the cake.
Yeah, she's...
It's a big hit as well. Oh,
yeah. She really was very much in charge, and she was very sharp. She's very perceptive. And I love that she just really did orchestrate this recontextualizing of her career into this new era. It actually reminds me a little bit of something that Reese Witherspoon did, back when she did Wild, and she produced that, and she really had done a bunch of not so great rom-coms leading up to that, and really has now entered this new role of being an actress and a producer, and
getting the roles that she wants to play.
Right. So, tale as old as time. Even before this, we should say, I mean, there's the Mary Pickfords and all the way back. You obviously know this. Yes, all in your books.
Yes. All in my books. A lot of women who had to forge their own path when it wasn't open to them. And Katharine Hepburn is one of the great examples of that, especially the way that she had such a long career, which was unheard of for an actress and of that time, and more Oscars when she was much older towards the end of her career. So it's pretty amazing to see everything she was able to accomplish in her many years on screen.
Oh, yeah. We still have 3 more Oscar wins to get to from her. So
I know. And she still holds that record, doesn't she?
Oh, yeah. Yep. But Frances McDormand is coming close.
Yeah, we'll maybe she'll get it. Yeah.
I don't know. But from the New York Times, they said, the way Miss Hepburn plays her with the wry things she is given to say, she is altogether charming character to meet cinematically. So... yes, audiences were charmed by her again. Put it in the newspapers, the headlines. Katharine Hepburn, we love her again. That was very much the sentiment. So I think we've said enough about Katharine Hepburn at this point. So let's, enough glowing praise. Let's move on to our final losing nominee, Martha Scott for Our Town. So... all due respect to Martha Scott, but when you look at this lineup, you have 4 of the most beloved or, at least well-known stars of this era, and then there's Martha Scott, and it just is what it is. Yeah. This is her film debut. Yes, it's amazing. And actually, she's reprising this role that she played on the stage because this started as a stage production, of course. It's still performed to this day. And I think when you compare that to all these other stars who are either, Oscar winners already or they've already starred in multiple films, she really does stick out. This was her only Oscar nomination. She would actually do a number of films after this that the Academy did like the 10 Commandments, Ben-Hur, she was in Sayonara, but yeah, this was it as far as individual nominations for her. So she's playing Emily Webb, who is a high schooler living in this small town of Grover's Corners in New Hampshire. And the people there pretty much live ordinary lives. She gets into a relationship with one of her classmates, George, played by a very young William Holden here. And they decide to get married, and then something happens where it's really hard to talk about her performance without talking about what happens in the third act. So this is your warning for those of you listening. We can talk about it in a few minutes, but she is really put in a grave situation, I suppose you could say.
Yes.
But
literally.
This is an interesting... yeah, right. But this is an interesting film, I think, just on a conceptual level, where we have this man who is talking directly to the audience as he's introducing us to all of these town folk and talking about their lives and sort of just summing up the themes of the movie. I think it's essentially an ensemble film. So even though Martha Scott is definitely the female lead here, she doesn't really dominate her film like the other four here do. I was actually looking on Screen Time Central, and she only has about 33 minutes of screen time compared to everyone else here, who is over an hour of their films. But curious, Alicia, what do you think of Our Town and her performance?
I mean, I think it's quite sweet. It's a sweet movie, obviously based on a Pulitzer Prize winning play by Thornton Wilder. And it's very much, about America and Americana and the small town and the everyday people and how you should be happy with a simple life and just the simple pleasures in life that we take for granted. So I think it's, my cat just meowed. I think it's a very, very sweet movie, and I think her performance is good. I mean, this was her big break for the stage. She hadn't done too much before that, or anything maybe before she was cast in this play, and then she got to reprise her role, like we said, her first ever screen role. It's not a huge role, but I think she brings a lot of warmth to it, and she does the best she can. It is always funny when you have an actress who's obviously not 15, 16 playing the younger version as well as the older version. That's always a tricky concept, and in classic films, unless they were really, really young, they didn't recast someone else to play a younger version. But I think she has a lot of she's very likable in this role, and she's quite sparkling on screen, again quite literally at one point, I think she does a good job with what the role involves. I don't think I can really fault her performance here.
Okay.
You can, obviously.
Perhaps we'll disagree slightly.
Okay.
I do not think she's bad. I'll just be upfront about that. I'll just say this. I've always really had a love for movies and stories that are set in suburbia, that are really interrogating the American dream and what we value and domestic drama and all of that. So this is definitely the kind of story that I'm just predisposed to like anyway. And I also think conceptually this is very inventive with this thing of directly addressing the audience in the way that makes it feel almost more like a parable kind of a thing, more than a traditional sort of story. I haven't seen the stage version, so I can only really judge this. But to be honest, I can't say that I really like this film other than, what was already inherent in the stage show itself. I do appreciate all those themes that you were mentioning there. And I think that is well told enough. I just think this adaptation is a little stiff feeling. And the performances don't really always come alive for me. And by the end, we get this ending that could be profound, I think, but it is another one that is tacking on this happy ending that for me kind of undoes a lot of the impact of the message. So I think this is a interesting story on a creative level, but with characters that feel to me more like archetypes rather than human beings. And it has a compelling message, but it's sort of muddled by this being made during the production code, I think.
Yeah.
I'd imagine that's part of why the ending is changed.
Oh, yeah. It's surprising that Thornton Wilder agreed with changing it. He was actually quite happy with changing the ending of the play to the film becoming a happy ending, he said, I think this is the right move. I think this is what we should do. I think it would have had a stronger impact if they went with the original play, but of course it just wasn't possible at this time in Hollywood.
Right.
But I thought within the film itself of what she had to perform, that she did a good job as Emily. It's like you said, not a hugely domineering role, but she did what was required. I think Variety, I saw a review saying that she brought sincerity and warmth to the role, and I definitely agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think she's good with the material she has.
Yeah.
The problem is, for me, the way it's presented doesn't really give her a lot of opportunity to really explore this character and to make choices, because I don't know. I just feel like this is a story where everything feels sort of predetermined, like we're just watching these people in a diorama almost, and like these are the roles for the pretty high school girl, and here's the boy who loves her, and the parents who are kind of unhappy, and I guess it just doesn't really come alive for me in that way. And again, I don't think she's bad. I don't think she's fair. I think she's just doing what the role requires and is very warm and sweet, but for me it doesn't always go much beyond that, unfortunately. And that's not her fault. It's just like when you look at other performances here, it doesn't quite compare.
Well, I think that it's more the film itself than her, that the film hasn't really lasted the test of time, and it's not one that we generally talk about. I mean, definitely not in comparison to the other 4 movies that we still revere and discuss and show at screen. And, you know, Our Town is sort of a forgotten film, but I still found it fun to see it again. I just thought, this is just a lovely little tale, you know, and I do like the breaking of the fourth wall with the narrator, Frank Craven, who played the narrator in the play version. So he and Martha Scott were the only 2 that were kept from the play. And it's always fun to see a young William Holden. I think he was 21 at the time. He's perfect for this kind of all-American guy. And even though his role as well doesn't have a whole lot to do apart from being the all-American nice guy, but his involvement in a film like this that was seen as being prestige because it came from the stage and a Pulitzer Prize winning play, you know, it really helped his career at such an early age.
Yeah. I do love seeing him at this early age, just being like a kind of a shy, like little cutie.
Yeah.
It's fun.
It is fun.
Compared to what we would see later on from him, is a little bit different. But yeah, for Martha, I think it's easy to sort of break this up into 3 acts. And for me, the only standout in the first act for her is when she's talking with her mother and she asks if she's pretty, you know? And again, even though Martha is almost 30 playing this role, I think she does capture that very youthful insecurity sort of feeling.
Yeah, and
at least.
And that feeling of, you know, when you're a young girl and you wonder, because you've sort of been indoctrinated, especially during the time in which the film is set, that is your currency, and that's what you have to give to the world, as being pretty. I thought that was a poignant moment when she asked her mother that question, and you get the sense that her mum hasn't been so forthcoming with compliments, that they've sort of just got along with it. She hasn't really complimented her for her looks, which is a good thing, but it also makes her wonder where she stands in this world.
Right. So that's pretty nicely established. And we go into the second act, and it's her and George. They have some level of success. Like, she's been elected secretary and treasurer, and he's this baseball star. And she's sort of bothered by how he's become conceited, and she confronts him about it. But then she almost immediately questions herself pretty soon after that, and is talking about how, like, girls are more nervous, and she apologizes. A good dramatic scene for her, again, sort of capturing that youthful energy.
Yeah, that youthful energy. And again, you know, perhaps I'm just reading too much into it, but it just also seemed to again speak to the position of women at that time, where she had something to say, and she was quite correct in her thoughts, and he ends up saying, yeah, I think you're right. I've been thinking about that, what you said. But at the time she had to immediately backtrack because she was worried about being too strong or losing him, and that's not the role of the wife. And we also see that weaved in a little bit into the story about the role of the wives and how every day they come down and they make breakfast every single day. And at one point the narrator says, they've been making breakfast, lunch and dinner for like 25 years or something. And I just thought, wow, imagine that life where you go down in the morning, you're first up, you're making breakfast, you're trying to call your family down to get them out for school, and then you immediately have to start like peeling peas for lunch, and then you have to start about dinner. It's a lot of the women's domestic work at the time that wasn't as thought of as important as man's work, but the film kind of touches on that, about their importance in this world as well.
Right, and also part of that is that they've done breakfast, lunch, and dinner for 25 years, and I think there's also a line that's like, and they still haven't had like a nervous breakdown.
Yes, exactly.
Which feels very incisive.
Yeah.
And then eventually she's getting married, and she's walking down the aisle. And here is when I think we start to see some of the seeds planted for the third act, which is that she really wants to remain young, and she doesn't want to really get married that much. And she's just silently walking down the aisle in this very stoic way. And you can tell that there is this sort of world of emotions happening inside her. I think that's a good, really, probably one of her better scenes.
Yeah. And they mention before her wedding that, she was upstairs and getting ready. You just imagine all the nerves involved with getting married. And then this sense of, okay, so this is what I'm supposed to do. And I love George, but again, following her mum's footsteps. And I'm sure she was like, okay, so now it's my turn to make the breakfast and, and the dinner and all of the, everything that comes with being a wife at that time.
Yeah, so then we get to the final act, and this is where I guess I'll warn people that if they haven't seen the film or the story, or they don't know it, then skip ahead to the next section. But yes, with this final act, I think we actually finally get to see her exploring this character with some substance, where it's flashing forward to 9 years later, I believe, and she's already had a kid with George, and she has another one on the way. But the first thing we see of her is her lying in bed, and she's not doing very well, and she's starting to slip away and actually does die. And I will just say, first of all, the first time I watched this a few years ago, I was like, hold on. Like, what just happened?
Yeah.
Right. And also part of me was like, so she earned a nomination for this in lead actress. I'm like, there was a lot going on in my mind when I was watching this. But then we see the rest of the film play out. Of course, she has stuff to do here. And you see, I think, in this third act where the nomination comes from, I would argue.
Absolutely. The kind of viewing her life through like an average day in her life. When she turns 16, she gets to revisit that day, and she sees it through new eyes, and you see her watching everything and saying like, why didn't I pay more attention to this? Why wasn't I looking at my mother at this time? And that really drives home the idea of the film, of these everyday moments that we take for granted, and that until they're gone, we sort of don't realize, and we're so involved in our everyday life. And you could definitely say that's true these days more than ever, that we're so distracted from what's in front of us, the person that's in front of us, the people that we live with, the people we're around every day. And it's kind of a sweet way to talk about just taking in every moment. She's like, oh, the chairs and this and that, and looking around her kitchen, and again getting a new sense of her life. The thing that was interesting to me when I first watched it years ago was the shift between, so you set up that there's this narrator and he is taking us through this town, but then suddenly we see the people who have died, and then it takes on more of Emily's perspective, and she starts to lead us through that part of the film. It's a big tonal shift that probably did work better on the stage when it could be done very simply. Although here in the film, you obviously get the benefit of being able to do some kind of special effect to show that this is a supernatural world.
Right. It's kind of abstract feeling, which I actually do think it captures that in a very striking way. But, you know, even before we get to her sort of flashing back to that 16th birthday, even in that sort of graveyard scene where she's pleading with her mother about just how tired she is, and there's just this really interesting sort of pronounced, almost like a cry in her voice, and she just feels very between worlds here, and she seems out of place in this environment, but in like a good way. Like she's not supposed to be here, and she hasn't really made peace with her life. So that's
her mom is just like, well, you're gonna have to get used to it. You can't go and visit those amazing times again. You'll just and she's very matter of fact about it all, and so there is something a little bit haunting about that scene, literally haunting.
Right. And getting that scene of her going back and saying like we don't have time to look at each other is probably her best most affecting line for me.
Yes, me too.
I mean, this is a very earnest performance on the whole, and it feels a little more old-fashioned to me, even in the context of 1940. And looking at these other performances, it feels of a certain time. So
yeah, it's definitely not cynical at all. It's it's very sweet and sentimental, and interesting that it's directed by Sam Wood, who also directed Kitty Foyle.
Right. That's right. Having a good year. But I guess I'm just not that enthusiastic about this performance on the whole. Like, I understand, obviously, the power of this third act is very emotional. I imagine it's even more affecting on stage. But for the most part, it sort of feels not outstanding for a lot of the film for me. That's where I come from.
Yeah. So. I think she has such a incredible supporting cast there with Beulah Bondi and Faye Bainter and Thomas Mitchell.
Faye Bainter, past Best Actress nominee.
Exactly. Yep. So she has such a incredible supporting cast there that, like you said, she doesn't necessarily stand out in the film, but I think she does a good job with what she was given. Yeah.
The New York Times said Martha Scott as the young girl is lovely and vibrant with emotion. So there you go.
Yeah, she's lovely.
I just calling her as the young girl is interesting, but we'll move past it. Anything else on Martha before we move on to our big winner?
Oh, I think we covered her as best as we could.
I think so. Yes. Again, I don't want to make it sound like I hated this performance. No. It's not outstanding for me. But every lineup has one of those, I think.
Yeah.
Here we go. Let's move on to our big winner, Ginger Rogers.
Yay.
For Kitty Foyle. Yes. So here we have, I believe, only the second instance of a Best Actress winner winning on their first nomination and then just never being nominated again. The first one being Mary Pickford. And, you know, based on her career up to that point, it's not a surprise maybe that she wasn't nominated before this, even though she was in a lot of popular musicals with Fred Astaire. You know, a lot of this more lighter work that it doesn't really get associated with Oscars even to this day, you know. So... yeah, you know, I understand why she couldn't really get to that level quite, even though she was very popular.
Yes.
Obviously, she was very well known for her dancing. Alicia, we have to talk about this coincidence of me having you on this episode where one of your books is called
Backwards and in Heels, which is, of course, a quote made about Ginger Rogers, that she did everything Fred Astaire did, but backwards and in heels. And I love that idea because it summed up what I was talking about in my first book about women who had all these obstacles in Hollywood but were able to do just as well as their male counterparts, even though they had more in their way. They had more of a difficult time. And I think that's true of Ginger Rogers. And like you said, this was really her first chance to show what she had outside of the musical world, and she was so popular for being with Fred Astaire and being paired with him, and they had a great friendship. But I think she was really, really desperate to show that she could do a role on her own and that she could be successful on her own.
Yeah, and really in the year or so before this, she really decides she's ready to break out, and she wants to do these dramatic roles that Katharine Hepburn is doing and that other leading ladies are able to do, but she's never given the opportunity to do. So, I think she was also able to take on more dramatic roles after Katharine Hepburn left RKO and went to MGM.
Mm-hmm.
So she was sort of associated, the two of them together, as sort of rivals, not really, but like multiple sources have said that they sort of competed with each other in a sense.
Yeah, well, she said that the leading guys, the guys in charge at RKO, just had a hard time as seeing her as anything but a dancer and a singer.
Right.
And then when she started doing comedy, they had a hard time to see her as anything but a dancer, singer, comedian. So she really had a tough time. I mean, especially in these years where the actors were so often typecast according to their persona, whether it was a persona that they chose or one that was prescribed to them. And it was really hard for them to show a great range at this time. So I think you're right that once Katharine Hepburn left, there was a little bit more opportunity for Ginger Rogers, being that she was such a big star at RKO.
Right. And here she is playing, of course, Kitty Foyle, who she comes from Philadelphia, and she dreams of being involved with this mainliner, these rich people in town. And she ends up meeting one of them, Wynn, played by Dennis Morgan. And they grow closer. He has a newspaper business, and he hires her on to do work for him, and they get involved, and then the newspaper fails. And even though they're married at a certain point, she decides to break it off because they're just from two different economic classes, really. And she just knows that it won't work out. And then she ends up meeting this doctor while she's working at a boutique, and she gets involved with him. And it's sort of a love triangle situation here, too. Without getting too into the weeds with the plot, there's a lot going on here. But I think in the crowds I associate with, there are people who say maybe with this lineup, Ginger Rogers wasn't the most deserving to win for this performance, that, there's others here like Bette Davis or Katharine Hepburn or whoever that maybe deserved it more. And there's people who say maybe Ginger Rogers should have won for one of her musical comedy performances, something she was more well known for. But what do you think? What do you think of this performance, her winning performance here?
Well, I think that one of the reasons why she won is because it was a great surprise for people to see her in this role. But she was able to bring so much of what she did in her comedies and her musicals to this part. There are some lighthearted moments. You see how charming she is as a character that you want to root for. You want her to do well in the end, but she also gets to just show such a big range. I know when she said afterwards, after playing the character, she said that she finally had the opportunity to create a three-dimensional portrait of a young American woman. And when the picture was finished, I felt I'd met the challenge. And so she gets to, again, it's like not so believable when she plays the younger version of Kitty Foyle, but she does get to show this character from a child all the way up to adulthood, and so much of her drama, her comedy, her heartbreak. It's a great role for an actress.
Yes. Also, the film, it has a certain structure to it where we're in the present day, and she's shown to be involved with these two guys, and the question is like, what is she going to do? And then it flashes back, and we do go through the many years that led up to this point, and the teenage years, yeah, I mean... Maybe it's just my own baggage of just knowing Ginger Rogers compared to like a Martha Scott, who I'm not as familiar with, but not the most believable. But she does have like a certain, almost like a spunk to her, which is not in the way that you get sometimes of someone who's just overacting, but she just has like a determined kind of attitude that is really quite compelling. And you see more of this as the film goes along. And I think for this performance, I don't think it's the best in this category necessarily, but I really think this is underrated. As much as the Best Actress win can be underrated, I think she just does a lot with her voice that is interesting to me. There's something very modern to me about this very natural way of speaking that she has that really does make her feel like a real person. Like she's almost this every woman type of character here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know the film has been criticized for being of its time, but for me, I still find the story relatable. I think many of us can sympathize with her, where you might love one person, but they're the wrong choice and you know it, and your heart wants to go with them, but your brain is saying, hang on, don't you remember? This happened before. You've said this before. You've been in this place before. You don't think it's going to be any different this time, do you? So I think that is quite modern in a way, or definitely timeless, and something that I definitely have related to over the years as I've grown older. I like that it is, like I said, a great role for a woman just because of the whole journey that she gets to go on. And Ginger is just, so likable on screen. She does have, like you said, the spunk and the determination. It also is very much a Cinderella movie, which they speak about at one point with her and her father. I love that her father's the men that wrote Cinderella deserve to be hung because they've put these ideas in these young people's heads. And also like how he said how the story ends, she says, but the prince and Cinderella live happily ever afterwards. And he says, well, but they end the story before it begins. And that's so true of women's pictures at this time, where it was all about, will she or won't she choose the guy, get married? Will she find love? Will she give up her career for love? Will she do this or that? But rarely did we get to see them married. And here again, the story ends before we really get to see how her choice plays out.
Right. You want to see a part two.
Yeah.
Of what truly happens.
And it speaks to the idea of fantasy. I mean, then that's something that she weaves in to this character, and the writing, obviously, throughout the journey of these fantasies of a better life that she has, and then the reality of that.
Right. Yeah. And, I think she gets big moments and she gets small moments. Like she gets to display a lot of range here, which I imagine was very impressive to voters. She has like this big grandstanding moment where we're pushing into a close-up and she's in Wynn's office and she's like, nobody owes a thing to Kitty Foyle except Kitty Foyle.
Yes.
Which is maybe a little bit of a goofy line, but I also think like there's a certain musicality to it. Some of her line deliveries that really, I think, show her background, you know, and her comedy, her musical. It's sort of like, this is probably not the greatest comparison, but it's what I'm thinking of, like a Melissa McCarthy kind of situation, who is very well trained in comedy and really knows how to play the rhythms of a scene just for maximum impact comedically. And then when they're in a more dramatic role, something like Can You Ever Forgive Me, she's still giving you the drama and the realism, but it's like she still has that spark, that sort of like rhythm of how to make a scene really work.
Yeah, and I think being able to sell some of those lines as well. Comedic actresses, they seem to just have much more of a fearlessness about them, or some kind of fearlessness about them, where they're able to throw themselves into these ridiculous situations and you go with them. And so then I think they're often able to use that for the drama as well. And when Ginger Rogers says a line that you said can sound a little hokey, she sells it because she knows how to sell all of these kind of this dialogue and her character to the audience, and you completely believe her the whole way through, and you really are on her side.
Yeah. And also, I mean, she does get to have a few moments of the more broad comedy, like when she like accidentally pulls the alarm at the store
And faints.
and she pretends to faint just to sort of play it off. And there's like that little meet cute situation with the doctor.
Yes.
You know, nice physical comedy there.
When he opens her eye and then she looks at him with her eye and then realizes, oh, wait, I've got to put it back in my head. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, really, you know, giving the people what they want and what they know and love of Ginger and what she's able to do there. I don't think that she has the greatest chemistry with either of the two men, to be honest. Like, they're not exactly Cary Grant and Jimmy Stewart, but, you know, not quite as invested in, like, what's she gonna do? Is it one or the other? But she still just has, like, a strong enough screen presence unto herself that she just really keeps you engaged in what she's going through on that personal level.
And I think that Dennis Morgan is quite charming as Wynn. I mean, he has that charm to him, and that you understand why she falls for him, or that she wants to go with him, and you don't trust everything that he says because you don't know if he's actually going to follow through or if he's just talking words. So I think I wouldn't say, like he's a Cary Grant or anything, but I think that he does bring that kind of charm to the role. And this film was quite racy at the time. I mean, they had to do a lot of reworking of the book to get it onto the big screen again because of the production code. But even what's left in the film, you see her really thinking about, and this has been pointed out by critics as well, really thinking about whether to have an affair or not, like whether she could be satisfied in being the other woman. And that's quite unheard of for 1940. And the idea of having a baby out of wedlock, I mean, there's a lot going on here that's was sort of pushing the boundaries of the time.
And didn't I read there was also something in the book that had to do with abortion?
Yeah,
too?
An abortion, which I don't know exactly. Maybe that was Kitty Foyle having an abortion, but obviously that was one of the rules in the production code, that you could not show or talk about abortion. So they changed that, obviously. But yeah, when Ginger Rogers first read the book, she was like, this is impossible. This is too salacious for me to play, and it will never make it to the big screen. But then the producer, David Hampstead, said, like, just wait till we do a proper rewrite. And of course, you have Dalton Trumbo writing the screenplay. And so it ended up being something that she said when she first read it, that she laughed and she cried, and she realized that whoever played the role would probably win an Oscar. And she did.
And there you have it. Yep. Well, I want to actually talk about probably one of the bigger reasons that she does win this Oscar, which is the scene towards the end where she's pregnant with Wynn's baby, and she wakes up in the hospital bed and she's just totally out of it. She's loopy, and I think it's her employer that's next to her, and she's sort of rambling to her with this very, very quiet tone of voice. And the way she modulates that scene to realizing, like, where is my baby? Like, what happened to my baby? For as melodramatic as that scene could be, I think she doesn't overplay it. Like, she really leans into the shock of what's happened rather than just, you know, immediately reacting in this like cheap emotional way.
Yes.
And I think that's part of what gets her the Oscar.
Yeah.
If she has an Oscar scene here, it's this.
Yeah, that one is really heartbreaking. The slow realization of what has happened without her employer Delphine even talking about it to her. She really catches on, and she knew that that was a really important scene. So she said in her book, My Story, that she was listening to sad music beforehand and trying to get in the mode. And then the first time she tried to shoot it, Sam Wood, the director, was jangling coins in his pocket, so she couldn't get into it. She had to take herself off set and go and listen to music. And then thankfully, I think someone spoke to Sam Wood and said, do you mind not jangling those coins during the scene? And so she came out and delivered a great performance. I don't know what number take that was, but I think it's it's really well done. Like you said, just the way in which she modulates the kind of emotions that she brings to that scene. Another moment that I think is shows why she won the Oscar and just is extremely heartbreaking is when she sees the son of Wynne. She realizes first that the wife is the woman in the boutique that she's trying to sell makeup to.
Right.
And then she realizes that the son that the woman has with her is Wynne's son, and he would have been the same age as her son had her son lived. And a lot of that just plays out on her face when you get an understanding of how she's feeling through her expressions, because she can't say anything because she's in front of the wife and the kid. So it's really just quite touching, that scene when you can see her thinking about everything that might have been had things worked out differently.
Yeah, it's so good. Just the last, 20 to 30 minutes of this film, she's so locked in and so effective and really heartbreaking. And you do just root for her. So it's a really good performance. I wish people wouldn't just beat her up for winning over some of these others, but
I know. And I think, Ginger Rogers was so well liked in Hollywood. So I think that's another big reason why she won, is that she had a lot of good faith around her, and a lot of Academy voters really appreciated her as a performer. And she just had a lot of friends, and so charming, likable in real life. She worked hard, kept her head down, and she really, I think, it surprised people with this performance. So whereas someone like Bette Davis, maybe they expected that performance from her.
Yeah, exactly. Before we really transition into talking about the Oscars here, this review, I think, is quite interesting from the New Yorker, because they said, without Miss Ginger, it would be very easy to remember how often many of the scenes shown in this film have been seen before on the screen.
Yeah, that's probably true. I mean, it's very kind of like a typical women's picture in many ways, but it also has...
But she elevates it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It has heart to it.
So as far as why she won, I think you said a lot of good things there about what contributed to it. But this was also a big year of campaigning where we had RKO, which apparently they collected a bunch of her good reviews and put them in an advertisement and put out an ad, and they were like, it's unanimous, as if to say everyone agrees she's the best.
That's so interesting.
Which is something that we kind of see today.
Yeah. And I don't know if it's true, I'm sure you would be able to tell me, being the Oscar expert that you are, but in Ginger's book she talks about how this was the first year where the press hadn't announced the winners beforehand, or either didn't know the winners beforehand or hadn't had it leaked to them. So it was PricewaterhouseCoopers who knew the winners and no one else.
Right. This was the first year of the sealed envelope,
right?
Which we would get today all the way through. So
Yep. So she said she didn't know whether she would win, didn't think so. Like many Best Actor winners and Best Actress winners, hadn't prepared a speech and, was shocked to win. But it certainly was a tough year for her. I wouldn't be surprised if that was true and she didn't think she would win against Bette Davis and Katharine Hepburn.
Right. Oh yeah, this is a real example of I wouldn't know either with this kind of competition. But even with David O. Selznick, he held a second premiere for Rebecca after the nominations were announced, and he renamed Hollywood Boulevard Rebecca Lane.
Oh, that's
so there was just a lot going on with campaigning already. We know about modern campaigning, but it's been around almost since the beginning.
Oh yeah, it's very political.
Yeah. So, I think maybe Joan Fontaine could have come close. We'll have the discussion of whether she was the runner-up later on, but yeah, and there's a compelling narrative with Katharine Hepburn and her big comeback, so intrigued to see what we say later on.
Yes.
But let's get to a few Twitter questions. We'll just run through them real quick since, of course, we are running long, as we are wont to do on this show. This is from our friend Fritz. Which nominee has the best movie?
Of these nominees?
Yes.
Gosh, yeah, it's hard. Again, hard to compare Philadelphia Story with The Letter, but I would say just personally, Rebecca. Rebecca is one that we still talk about. Film critics talk about. Filmmakers have been so inspired by. A lot of people have been influenced by. It definitely has the Jane Eyre gothic mood about it, but it also has a lot more, thanks to the direction of Alfred Hitchcock and his first American film. So I would say Rebecca. What about you?
I agree. Joan Fontaine has the best film in this lineup. But Katharine Hepburn, she comes pretty close with Philadelphia Story.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've probably seen the Philadelphia Story more times than Rebecca just because it's so much fun to watch.
Right. That's fair. Yeah. Another one from Fritz.
Fritz.
Ginger's win is often considered an upset, but shouldn't it have been obvious?
I don't know if it should have been obvious, but
Yeah, not necessarily.
Yeah, but I don't think it was too much of an upset either, because I think that when you delve into it, as we've done, she did show a lot of her talents as an actress and her skill particularly. So I don't think it was too much of an upset, but maybe just a surprise between the heavy hitters that she was up against.
I mean, I think whenever you have Bette Davis and Katharine Hepburn in the mix, it's not obvious that like another person is going to win it.
No, it's like going up against two Meryl Streeps.
Right.
Or Meryl Streep and a Frances McDormand.
Well, there you go. Yeah, that's a great modern comparison. But yeah, I mean, plus Joan Fontaine in the Best Picture winner. I mean, we already talked about why we think Ginger won, but I would not rate this as a particularly obvious win, even in hindsight. So,
No.
yeah. Let's move on to Chelsea. Which hot and funny film should Ginger really have won for?
Hot and funny film.
Yes.
I mean, I just have such a soft spot for her films with Fred Astaire. But I also love her in Bachelor Mother. That's one that I think she was also really good at. So I'm going to say Bachelor Mother because of the way she portrayed, you know, this mother or a single woman who comes across a baby and then everyone doesn't believe her that it's not her child. It's very funny, but again, she gets to layer in some drama there as well. What would you say?
Very good pick. Yeah, a lot of the Fred and Ginger movies are coming to mind. Top Hat.
Yeah.
But I do love her in Gold Diggers of 1933.
Yeah, early role.
If only for the scene where she sings in Pig Latin.
Money. Oh yeah, exactly.
Which is just a tour de force.
Impressive.
Yes, just in sheer technical skill.
Yeah.
Yeah. But Christoph N. said, if you could choose a single film from Ginger Rogers' filmography to give her an Oscar nomination or win for, which would it be? I mean, that's pretty much the same question. But
yeah, did she? Well, this was her only nomination, right? So this was her.
Right.
So yeah, I would say again something like Bachelor Mother.
Yes.
Yeah, or like Barclays of Broadway, just as a cap on her career with Fred Astaire.
That's
just
true.
to be like, thanks for everything.
That's a good choice. Yes. Sam Meltzer said, since this was her only nomination, do you think that there were times where she was the 6th place of the year and just didn't make it in?
Yeah, I'm not sure because, I mean, she worked really hard on her acting throughout her career, and her mother, Leela, was such a big supporter of that and a force in Hollywood, getting her roles and also looking after Lucille Ball at the same time. But But given that she was often in comedic roles and musicals, as we said, those weren't the films that were generally in contention for acting Oscars.
Right. Maybe Top Hat could have come close or in a 6th place, possibly because that's a Best Picture nominee. But yeah, hard to say. Patrick Stokes said, apparently Joel McRae said Ginger Rogers should have won for Primrose Path instead of Kitty Foyle. Do you agree?
Oh yeah, I still prefer Kitty Foyle as a performance, but I forgot that was the same year as this.
Yeah, because they also go on to say, does her win make more sense as a having a good year Oscar?
That's, I think, another factor for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I actually haven't seen Primrose Path, so I can't speak to the quality.
Yeah.
But I think in terms of impacting the vote, it doesn't hurt.
No.
I don't know if it always helps, but
yeah, it just
it can't
seems
hurt.
to
It's keeping you in the consciousness.
Always seems to be the kind of extra story, which I know happens more now maybe than the past, but I think, yeah, just having several performances in the 1 year always helps.
Matt Yumanola says, can you compare Davis's performance in The Letter to Dark Victory? Is her performance more indicative of Wyler's craft than the actress's? I wouldn't go that far, but I get where it's coming from. I think it's a very calculated character in The Letter, and maybe it's a more compelling film, but I personally think she's actually better in Dark Victory because she gets to show even more of her range, especially that vulnerability that we don't always see. So that's my hot take.
Yeah, I mean, I really love Dark Victory and the whole transition that she goes on as that character. I mean, there's also a lot to be said about how women who are shown to be like partying and free and not caring about marriage and independent, like she is in Dark Victory, have to die in the end because how dare you? But I think she's so fun in that movie. Again, she shows her charm. It's a lighter character in many ways, even though she dies and it's quite a sad destruction of her health and her life, and she really comes to terms with everything. You have the great lightness at the front that you don't have with The Letter, which is quite serious from the very beginning. So I would say I love her in Dark Victory. I think she gets to show more of her charm in that film, more of her lightness.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. This is from Sophia Simonello, past guest. If Fontaine won for Rebecca, do we luck out and avoid her awful win for Suspicion?
Awful win.
And in parentheses, she says, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure her sister would have been happy if she didn't win for Suspicion.
Oh, we'll get to that.
Yeah, I mean, I thought she was great in Suspicion too, but yes, the question is always, is this a make good? I mean, much like Jimmy Stewart winning for the Philadelphia Story, that was kind of a make good for Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and he thought that Henry Fonda should have won for Grapes of Wrath. So there's always that element. But she was great in Suspicion as well. Very, very different character.
I think for the question, I don't think she would win back to back, so probably she doesn't win for Suspicion.
Even if she won here. Oh, that was the question.
Right,
Sorry,
exactly.
I misunderstood the question.
No,
I thought it was like,
okay.
should she have won for, this instead of Suspicion? But yeah, I agree with you. It would have been hard to do back-to-back wins in Hitchcock films.
Right. This is another one from Fritz. Got a lot of questions, Fritz. I love this question, by the way. What name would you give Joan Fontaine's character?
Yeah, that is a good one. It needs to be something very, I think, plain and unassuming, because Rebecca has a kind of level to it, right? Rebecca.
Right.
So I think it needs to be in opposition to that. I don't know what, though. What's your idea?
When I saw this question, I had this answer, and I'm like, this is kind of twisted, but it sort of works. What if we name her Olivia?
Yeah, that would be good. That would be good.
After her sister.
Yeah.
And really give her even more of that like fraught dynamic of having to respond to the name Olivia.
The feud, Yeah, but Olivia is also a really sweet name, so it could work.
It is.
For the character.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what I'll go with. This is from Gordon at Mark Wahlberg. In the alternate timeline where neither Betty nor Katharine had won before, do you think one of them ends up victorious? If so, which one?
I think so. I think Bette Davis. Because Bette Davis is so fantastic in that role. But as you say, it's a role that we've seen before from her. So it's sort of a role that's somewhat expected of her. And I think much like someone like Meryl Streep, you know, she's so good that you go, yeah, of course, she's so good. But when you watch her films, you're like, wow, Meryl Streep is really good. But I think it just because she's always been nominated, you don't really, you take it for granted almost how good she is.
Yeah, I think it's Bette. I think it's Bette for sure. She wins.
Yeah.
Even like Katharine Hepburn, maybe, but it's a much more lighter kind of story and performance. I think if Bette doesn't have one already, she definitely has one here with the letter. So this is from Grig. Would you have preferred Vivien Leigh to Joan Fontaine and Rebecca? And do you think she could have been nominated or won? I would not have preferred that personally.
No, I think, you know, I know that Vivien Leigh was capable of playing very vulnerable characters, as she showed so well in A Streetcar Named Desire. But here, I think the fact that she played Scarlett O'Hara, you have this inbuilt idea of who she is. And part of the success of Joan Fontaine's performance is that it was her first big lead role in a picture. So she didn't come with the baggage, and she was able to sell that innocence and naivete, I think, more than maybe Vivien Leigh would have been able to do or could have done.
Yeah, I don't think she can really play the role in the way that Joan Fontaine could. Would she have been nominated? Yes, maybe, but I don't think she would have won. Because again, that would be back-to-back, and that's unlikely. Andrew Carden said, is Martha Scott in the right category?
Yeah, I did think that. And you spoke about the screen time because it really is an ensemble piece. So that's always the question, isn't it, when it comes to Oscars? It's like, what constitutes a lead role versus a supporting role? And I know a lot of the times it comes down to what the studio pitches.
Right. I mean, I think she's a lead. If anyone
probably
is a
just
lead,
because of
it's
the whole
probably
ending,
her.
Right? If she didn't have that
Right,
whole ending,
exactly.
then it would have been more of a supporting role.
Yeah, but I mean, the entire third act is centered around her. So
That's true.
By the end, it does feel like her story. But, you know, I could see it if they were like, well, if we want to actually get a win, then maybe we fraud her into supporting like we do see sometimes these days. Just saying.
Absolutely.
We got a number of questions just as we wrap up here about who else was in the mix, essentially, that didn't make it in. Gabe the Joker said who was sixth in this lineup, which is really, really hard to say, especially when we don't have other precursors to really indicate what else was in the mix other than like the National Board of Review or New York Film Critics, who are around already at this point.
It is hard to say because when you look at a lot of the other films that were nominated that year, a lot of them were dominated by men. I mean, The Grapes of Wrath being a big one. There's some great supporting female roles in that, but it's really Henry Fonda.
Yeah. But just from looking at the National Board of Review, they actually listed a whole bunch of actors, which was helpful for me, that maybe some of them were in the mix, where we had Jane Bryan and Flora Robson for We Are Not Alone. We have Betty Field from Of Mice and Men, actually. We have Greer Garson for Pride and Prejudice, Vivien Leigh for Waterloo Bridge, and then Ginger Rogers again for Primrose Path.
Yeah, so none of them hugely stand out.
Right. Maybe Vivien Leigh just as an afterglow.
Yeah, or Greer Garson. You know, she's good as Elizabeth Bennet in that version of Pride and Prejudice. With Laurence Olivier, right?
Yes.
Yeah. He had a good year.
So.
That's right. And that was another role he wanted Vivien Leigh to play, of course.
Right.
Yeah.
Common theme. And both Christoph and once again Fritz want us to talk about Rosalind Russell in His Girl Friday.
Oh, yes. I love her in His Girl Friday. That is a snub. I forgot that was 1940, but of course you're totally right. It was. And just the fact that role was originally supposed to be a man, and then Billy Wilder realized when he was doing some back and forth with his secretary to practice the dialogue that it actually worked better as a man and a woman. And then Rosalind Russell really had to show that she was capable of comedy, which of course she did the year before with the women, but being able to do that fast-paced dialogue. Her and Cary Grant have such a great dynamic. So yeah, where was she? Where was she in this mix?
Where was
Again,
she?
because it was a screwball
Where was
comedy,
she?
I guess. It wasn't
It was
as revered or as celebrated as a drama.
yeah. It's the it's like a specific brand of overt comedy that even it isn't like the Philadelphia Story isn't really like His Girl Friday. You know what I mean?
No,
Like,
His Girl Friday, another one that I will show my friends who don't watch classic films, and it seems like it's a joke. It seems like it's a Saturday Night Live sketch because it
seems
so
like they're in a
fast.
rush to get to the end of the movie.
Exactly.
With how fast they're talking.
But I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. I love that
Yes,
movie.
I adore that movie. Oh my God. She definitely deserves to be here. Rosalind Russell.
Yes.
In my eyes, if you replace Martha Scott, this is an all-time lineup.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Good lineup.
Just saying.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's make this our verdict. Who do we think was the runner-up to Ginger Rogers?
Oh, it's tough because I went back and forth on this question, and for a while I was like, I think it's Joan Fontaine because I really love her performance here, but then I was like, I can't go past Bette Davis because I just think she's a master. Again, like we were talking about, you take her for granted because she was so good, but if you can look at it in isolation and as if this was the first time she was nominated, which I know is probably not the question, but I would choose her as the runner-up. What about you?
Yeah. I think Joan. I think,
That's a good choice
the film
too.
winning
Yeah.
Best Picture plus the big campaign that we talked about, the fact that she was a star on the rise, which is something that we've seen the Academy really go for, that kind of narrative. And, the fact that she wins the very next year seems to be a sign that they were ready to give her something. So I would very tentatively go with that today. My answer could change by the time I even release
I know.
this.
Yeah,
so.
it's true. I will probably change my mind about 5 times as I
Yeah.
did in the
I
lead
could
up
see
to
Betty.
this.
I could see right.
Catherine.
I could see Katharine.
Not
That's a
really
very compelling narrative
Martha
too.
Scott, although I still think she
Probably
did
not
well
Martha.
with what she had. But yes, I don't think she would win
Yeah.
here.
Right. Well, the big final question for you, Alicia.
Yes.
Who would you have voted for?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Even though I just said that Bette Davis would be the runner-up, I do think that if I were voting, I would vote for Joan Fontaine in Rebecca because it's such an impressive early performance, and you can tell even in that film that she is going to be a star. I mean, it's a star-making role.
A Star is Born.
A star is
Truly.
born, yeah.
Yes. And guess what? I am in agreement with you.
Hey.
I think Joan Fontaine would get my vote. Absolutely. I think what she does is very tricky and way harder than it looks. And I think she is the emotional core of Rebecca and totally makes the film hold up today, all these years later. So, Joan, you'd get my vote.
Yay, Joan. 2 votes.
But yes, but respect to pretty much everyone else in the lineup. I mean, it's in another year, I would probably pick someone else. Like, it's one of those really strong years that it's tough.
Absolutely, but it's such a wonderful year for film, and this is why I love doing this podcast, because I get to just geek out about these movies and these women.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Alicia, for joining me today. This was a long and winding episode, but I had so much fun talking actresses with you.
Yeah,
so thank
me
you.
too. Thank you so much for having me on again and waiting until I had written most of my book to be able to do this. I really wanted to give it the time that it deserved, and I'm glad I got to rewatch the films and talk about them with you. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. I really appreciate it. And where can people find more of you on the internet and otherwise, since you are also in bookstores?
Yeah, these days I try to stay off the internet. So I actually haven't been on Twitter for a long time, and same with Instagram. So the best way to keep up with me is to either watch me on Turner Classic Movies. If you have that cable network, I am there on every Tuesday night and Sundays during the day. And I also host TCM Imports, which is our foreign film series. Or you can catch one of my books in all good bookstores. I mean, probably not many bookstores, but some bookstores. And Amazon is Backwards and in Heels, The Female Gaze. And soon to come, Girls on Film. It's more of a personal book, so I hope you really enjoy it. It should be out in March, all things being well.
Very exciting. Yay. Okay, well, thank you all so much for listening. You can find me on Twitter at Kevin_Jacobson, and the podcast is at Oscar Runner-Up on Twitter. I'm on Instagram at @AndTheRunnerUpIs. Rate, review, and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you liked what you heard and want to hear more, patreon.com/AndTheRunnerUpIs, and you can hear a whole bunch of bonus episodes. And next week on the show, we will be talking about the 1941 Best Actress race, another real all-star lineup. The nominees were Bette Davis for The Little Foxes, Olivia de Havilland for Hold Back the Dawn, Joan Fontaine for Suspicion, Greer Garson for Blossoms in the Dust, and Barbara Stanwyck for Ball of Fire. A great lineup.
Great lineup.
With the winner being,
great films.
with the winner being Joan Fontaine.
Yay.
So that is what to watch before next week. Thank you so much again, Alicia.
Thank you, Kevin.
And with that, I will bid you all adieu.